I was kidnapped by my father when I was 5 years old, and I can barely remember the experience. My mother has told me about it only twice. Once when I had asked about my father during a Father's Day event at my school where you were supposed to spend the whole day with your dad, and I was basically the only kid in school without one. The second time was more recently, but this time she showed me something that chilled me to the bone. Let me go back to the beginning and explain the story a bit more before I tell you what she showed me. When I was 3 years old, my mother claims that my father had cheated on her. They'd been married for over 9 years at this point, so my mother was heartbroken to find out. She says that my father tried to convince her that they could work past it. My mother, on the other hand, saw this as being the end of their relationship. It was, because 2 years later they were divorced and I was the child of a broken family. My father retained some custody over me, and I would spend every other weekend with him. According to my mother, this arrangement didn't last long. My father lost his job and his apartment. This went against the court agreement that gave my father custody of me, since he didn't have a safe place for me and wasn't making money to care for me. So my mother revisited the courts and got my father's custody rights suspended. Instead, he now had visiting rights. My mother says that my father had expressed his dislike of the whole situation constantly, but whenever he was around me, he was just the perfect dad. Again, I can barely remember this part of my life. I don't know if I suppressed the memories. The most consistent memory I have of my father is going for ice cream, watching movies, and eating pizza, which my mother has told me was one thing we used to do on Saturdays. Now, it was during my 5th birthday party that my father finally decided to do something about the situation that he disliked so much. My mother told me that my father had never missed one of my birthdays and that she wasn't about to get in the way. His visitation rights only meant he could come visit me at home every second Sunday, but my mother had invited him to my 5th birthday party that Sunday. That was the day I was kidnapped. After I opened up all my birthday gifts and we cut the cake, I just vanished. Now, my father was still at the birthday party. He and my mother were talking in the kitchen before one of my friends ran in to ask where I was. They had wanted to play with one of my new toys, but they couldn't find me. My mother said she didn't panic at first because I had a history of hiding whenever I felt overwhelmed or if something upset me. So she simply searched the house, calmly checking all of my usual hiding spots. It wasn't until she couldn't find me in any of those hiding spots and several minutes of calling for me and receiving no answer that my mother started panicking. My mother has said many times how well my father played the role. He was so worried. He hopped in his truck and drove around the neighborhood, calling for me out the open window. He went and knocked on all the neighbors' doors to ask if they'd seen me. Eventually, they called the police and reported me missing. I was missing for over 3 days, and absolutely no one knew what had happened to me. There were no suspects. The original theory was that I had just wandered down the street while no one was looking, and that either someone had grabbed me out of opportunity or that I was simply lost. This is where we get back to the thing that my mother wanted to show me. Now, she never told me exactly how they found out that my father had kidnapped me or how they found me. They just did. All I had known up until this point was that my father had kidnapped me when I was 5 years old and that he was in prison for it. What my mother showed me changed any thoughts I had of my father and any of the memories I had of him. The second time my mother told me this story, I was 12 years old. She finally told me about the voice recording they had from the baby monitor in my bedroom that very same day. The recording starts with the sound of a door opening, then the muffled audio of what sounds like a little girl humming a song. Then the humming cuts and the sound of a man's voice. "Hey, finish your cake. We need to go right now. Hurry," a deep voice says. Suddenly, the little girl screams, and we can hear the sound of things getting knocked over or thrown around. Then the door closes and there is silence. My mother told me that the little girl in the recording was me because I was humming my favorite song and she can never mistake my voice for anyone else. As for the man in the recording, it was no doubt it was my dad. She told me that he'd grabbed me from my room and tossed me in his trunk while everyone was busy dishing out the cake. All they could find was the cake I'd dropped in my bedroom when he grabbed me. Apparently, according to the police and my mother, I was in the trunk the entire time my father drove around looking for me. He'd kept me in the trunk for the whole day while they spoke with the police and searched the neighborhood for me. I don't remember a single second of this. My father went on to keep me in the trunk for the next few days I was missing. He would open the trunk up and sit down with me, feed me, and talk with me. Eventually, he would just close the trunk back up and leave me there throughout the night and whenever he was busy. I have no idea what his plan was and how long he was thinking of keeping me there. When the police found me, they opened the trunk and the evidence was clear that I had been living in there. They said it smelled strongly. I was still wearing the same clothes I had on when I got kidnapped, and there was a dirty pillow and blanket in there with me. The only way to describe it was cruel and inhumane. My father, of course, was prosecuted and sent to prison, while my mother wanted full custody of me. She decided to raise me with no knowledge of my father or the time we had spent together before this. I never questioned it, but I did always wonder about him. I'm glad my mother finally decided to show me this footage. The way my father just picked me up and tossed me in the trunk of his car as if I was some object and not his daughter just tells me how little he actually cared for me. This was an act of revenge against my mother, not a desperate attempt for him to win his daughter back. I'm glad he's not in my life. Every time I listen to that recording, it breaks my heart and chills me to the bone.